The sea shimmered like molten glass beyond the terrace, where laughter spilled from champagne lips and music floated through the warm afternoon air. The wedding was a spectacle of perfection, the kind that photographs could never quite capture, but envy could. Beneath the canopy of white roses, everything gleamed except the hearts beneath it. Servants moved quietly among the guests, their black uniforms a silent shadow against ivory gowns and crystal flutes. Then, in the stillness between laughter, a single glance broke the illusion. The bride turned, her voice honeyed with superiority, calling out to a waitress whose trembling hands betrayed a small mistake. The crowd hushed. The ocean seemed to hold its breath, and somewhere within that pause, between pride and shame, a hidden history began to stir. Music swelled again, but it could not mend what silence had broken. Beneath the laughter, something hollow echoed. The bride basked in shallow triumph, unaware that the eyes around her no longer gleamed with admiration but caution. The groom stood motionless, a polite smile painted over confusion. That fleeting glance had pierced him deeper than he wished to admit. Memories he thought buried whispered through the rhythm of the ocean. The waitress, somewhere beyond the terrace, steadied her hands and her heart, pretending the sting was only from spilled champagne. But the sea knew better. It had seen enough vows broken in the name of appearances. Inside the reception hall, laughter returned in fragments, like a broken melody struggling to find rhythm. The guests toasted endlessly, chasing comfort in bubbles and noise. The groom's gaze wandered despite himself, drawn again and again to the fleeting figure behind the tables. She moved like silence itself, steady and deliberate, untouched by vanity. Each time their eyes met, something inside him twisted, a longing not for the past, but for the truth it held. The bride noticed his distraction, her smile stiffening just enough for the light to catch her unease. The moment was brief, but beneath the grandeur of chandeliers and violins, a subtle fracture widened in the perfect facade of joy. Outside, the evening had deepened into velvet blue. The bride stepped out for air, her laughter brittle as she spoke to guests about perfection, the dress, the venue, the future. But her reflection in the glass doors wavered. Inside, the groom lingered, pretending to engage in conversation while his thoughts drifted toward the kitchen, where he knew the waitress was quietly clearing dishes. Every clink of porcelain was a ghost of memory, every fleeting glance a reminder of debts unpaid. Beneath the surface of luxury, guilt stirred like a tide against stone, and for the first time that night, the groom realized perfection felt unbearably hollow. The final toast approached. Guests gathered under the canopy where fairy lights shimmered like constellations, unaware that beneath the golden sparkle, something fragile was about to shift. The bride stood radiant beside her husband, smiling for the cameras that adored her illusion. Yet the groom's mind drifted to the memory of rain, of a dim cafe, of a woman who once offered him warmth when he had nothing to give back. That same woman now stood a few feet away, unseen, her presence soft yet unyielding. As applause echoed, he raised his glass, not to celebrate perfection, but to bury regret. The sea wind carried the faint scent of salt and truth, and for the first time the bride sensed the chill of something she could not control. The night thickened with salt and silence. The crowd had shifted to the dance floor, where laughter fluttered like moths drawn to light, but his thoughts lingered elsewhere. Beneath the hum of music, the groom stepped away, following an invisible pull that led him down the corridor behind the banquet hall. There, by the service door, he found her, alone, arranging glassware with mechanical calm. For a moment, the years dissolved. The scent of detergent, the clink of glass, the faint hum of the sea, all of it returned him to the tiny cafe where kindness had once been his only refuge. He spoke her name softly, but she didn't turn. The past had a way of testing silence before daring to break it. When she finally looked up, The years between them seemed both infinite and fragile. The air trembled with unspoken stories, the kind that could only be told through eyes. He tried to smile, but it faltered into apology. She answered with stillness, her calm defiance far louder than accusation. The world behind them carried on, laughter, dancing, and the shallow rhythm of celebration. But in that quiet corner, truth lingered like the ghost of a song, unfinished. They spoke no words, for there were none to bridge what had been lost to time. And yet, in their silence, both understood that the past was not gone. It was only waiting to be remembered. The sound of her voice broke the spell, low even, but edged with something brittle. She spoke of the past as one might speak of a distant country, where love had been both a shelter and a wound. He listened, each word cutting through his composure like rain on silk. The guilt that had slept for years rose to meet him, cold and familiar. Outside, laughter burst again, masking the tension that thickened between them. The scent of roses and champagne carried through the air vents, mocking their raw honesty. When she turned away, he realized he had never truly left her. He had merely traded his heart for comfort. He wanted to apologize, but apologies felt too small against the weight of everything left unsaid. The memory of that rainy night years ago flashed in his mind. A younger man soaked, penniless, finding refuge in her cafe, her kindness offered without reason. That memory now stood before him, clothed in humility and strength, serving the people who once would have ignored them both. He realized then that love had not abandoned him. He had abandoned it for the illusion of stability. A distant cheer echoed from the terrace, the bride's laughter sharp as glass. He closed his eyes, torn between duty and the ache of honesty, knowing the night would no longer let him pretend. The door burst open. A rush of perfume, laughter, and cold air. The bride appeared, radiant and furious, her voice slicing through the fragile quiet. The groom straightened, the past vanishing like smoke, while the waitress bowed her head in instinctive retreat. Questions spilled from the bride's lips, coated in charm but sharpened by jealousy. The silence that followed was louder than accusation. For an instant, all three stood locked in an unholy trinity, pride, guilt, and grace, suspended in the flicker of candlelight. The groom's lips parted, but before he could speak, the waitress whispered something soft and final. A truth meant for him alone. Then she slipped back into the kitchen's darkness, leaving only the sound of her footsteps and the echo of what could never be reclaimed. The dance floor glittered like a dream crafted for envy, but beneath the music's spell, tension simmered unseen. The bride had returned to her guests, her smile now weaponized, radiant yet venomous. Every gesture, every laugh was sharper, a performance built to prove that nothing could rattle her reign. The groom stood at her side, applause echoing like judgment. Across the room, the waitress resumed her quiet duties, her presence almost ghost-like among the gold and silver finery. Yet eyes followed her, whispers forming ripples of curiosity. The bride's laughter grew louder, as though volume could drown suspicion. But cracks had begun to appear beneath the sparkle. And behind those perfect smiles, envy and fear began their quiet waltz. It began subtly, a spill of words disguised as humor. The bride, her voice dripping with charm, called the waitress over to serve wine before her guests. The laughter that followed carried a cruel edge. Each question was a blade wrapped in silk. "Do you often serve weddings like this? Do you ever dream of being on this side of the table?" The crowd laughed, but the sound faltered when they saw the calm in the waitress' eyes. She answered softly, with humility that disarmed arrogance. For the first time, the bride's poise wavered. Pride was not built to face grace. It could only crumble before it. The bride's laughter cracked like ice against marble, ringing too loudly for sincerity. Her mother joined in, nodding approvingly, while guests exchanged sidelong glances. The waitress simped back, dignity her only shield. The groom's hand twitched toward his glass, knuckles pale from restraint. He wanted to speak, to end the farce, but duty chained his voice. The music faltered, uncertain whether to carry on. Somewhere outside, waves crashed against the cliffside, indifferent to human vanity. And for a fleeting second he envied the sea, bound to nothing but truth. After the laughter faded, silence returned heavier than before. The bride's eyes glistened, not from guilt but from wounded vanity. It was not enough to be admired. She needed to be envied. Yet, when she looked at the waitress' stillness, she saw something she could never buy: peace. The groom watched, torn between two worlds that had collided in his heart. He had chosen wealth, but wealth had chosen emptiness. The waitress gathered plates with quiet precision, never meeting his gaze. Yet every movement spoke of strength disguised as surrender. Somewhere between the glimmer of cutlery and the hush of violins, the truth began to whisper. The greatest grace is found in endurance. The evening neared its end, but the bride refused to let the moment rest. She rose, glass in hand, voice trembling with emotion that wasn't love, but possession. She toasted her new life, her perfect husband, her flawless night. Yet her words sought to wound, not celebrate. The guests applauded out of obligation, though their eyes betrayed discomfort. The groom's gaze fell to the floor. The waitress turned away. A fragile tear formed in her eye, but never fell, dignity refusing to yield to cruelty. When the applause faded, the bride stood alone in her victory, surrounded by emptiness, dressed as admiration. The night was no longer hers. It belonged to the truth that waited, patient and unrelenting. The night wind rolled through the open doors, carrying the faint scent of salt and jasmine. The guests had begun to drift toward the beach for photographs, leaving the hall echoing with soft music and half-empty glasses. The groom stood alone at the balcony, watching the moon stain the sea with silver. He thought of the promises made and the truths buried beneath them. Somewhere behind him he heard quiet footsteps. Familiar, careful, and impossible to ignore. He didn't turn immediately. He knew that voice, even in silence. The air between them felt fragile, suspended between confession and restraint. Some secrets wait years to be spoken, and when they finally rise, they do so without mercy. When he finally spoke, his words trembled, heavy with gratitude and guilt. He remembered the cold rain, the quiet cafe, and the warmth she'd offered when he was nothing but a man chasing survival. She had given him food, a place to breathe, and a reason to keep going. He'd promised to return, to make something of himself. And he had, but not for her. The truth spilled between them like spilled wine. Messy. Irreversible. Her eyes softened, not with anger but with acceptance. Some debts could never be repaid, only remembered. The past had not come to haunt him. It had come to remind him of what he'd become. Her voice broke the silence like a prayer, gentle, forgiving, final. She told him she had never hated him, that his leaving had hurt, but had also taught her strength. Her forgiveness was not for him alone. It was for herself, to unchain her heart from the ghosts of what could have been. He listened, every word slicing deeper than accusation ever could. In her calm, he saw everything he had lost. Not the romance, but the purity of something real. The sea sighed against the cliffs, and somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted faintly from the beach. The world carried on, but he stood still, realizing that sometimes love's truest form was letting go. The sound of footsteps shattered the fragile quiet. The bride emerged from the shadows, her gown catching the moonlight like a blade. Her expression was unreadable, a smile too calm, eyes too cold. She had seen enough to understand, but not enough to forgive. Words spilled, soft at first, then venomous. She accused, questioned, and mocked in equal measure, her pride wounded more than her heart. The waitress said nothing. Her silence was armor. The groom tried to explain, but truth had already twisted beyond his control. The night that had begun as a celebration now stood on the edge of ruin, held together only by the trembling weight of restraint. The confrontation unfolded like a storm trapped in glass. The bride's voice shook, no longer powerful but pleading, her pride unraveling with every accusation. The groom tried to soothe her, but his words fell hollow. The waitress, quiet as dawn, took a single step forward, not to defend herself, but to free them both. She told the truth plainly, without shame. She had once loved him, and he had once belonged to another world. Nothing more, nothing less. Her honesty was final, her grace undeniable. The bride fell silent, her fury dissolving into disbelief. The truth didn't destroy the illusion, it simply revealed what was already broken. The whispers began slowly, a rustle of silk and rumor sliding through the crowd. Faces turned, voices lowered, and the illusion of perfection began to tremble. Guests who once smiled now stared with careful curiosity, searching for the fracture in the fantasy. The bride returned from the terrace, her beauty unshaken but her aura fractured. Her husband's eyes betrayed too much. Her composure betrayed even more. The waitress resumed her work in silence, unaware that she had become the heartbeat of every whispered story. Beneath the chandeliers, laughter sounded forced, too brittle to survive the truth. The night had shifted. Admiration had turned into scrutiny, and envy had begun to decay into doubt. The mother was the first to notice. Her face hardened, her perfect smile curdling into panic. She approached her daughter swiftly, whispering commands disguised as comfort. The bride nodded, but her lips trembled. Perfection was slipping away and she could feel it. The guests' laughter no longer soothed, it mocked. The groom watched helplessly, his silence a confession of its own. Somewhere near the entrance, the waitress served wine again, her movements steady despite the heavy air. She did not see herself as a storm, but she was. Her calm presence tore through the fragile fabric of pretense, leaving the rich to face their own reflections. The orchestra struck up another song, desperate to drown the whispers, but the rhythm faltered with every gaze cast toward the bride. Her laughter rang hollow now, a brittle echo of what it had been. She forced her charm upon the room, twirling her glass and gesturing grandly, but every move felt rehearsed, desperate. The groom's distance became impossible to ignore. He stood by the balcony doors, face pale with quiet remorse. And the waitress, steady, unbothered, radiant in humility, moved among the guests like a mirror, reflecting what true grace looked like. The contrast was unbearable. For the first time in her life, the bride felt small in a room built to worship her. It happened so quickly that no one breathed. A guest, emboldened by gossip, asked a question too direct, too dangerous. The room froze as the words hung in the air. How long have they known each other? The bride's smile faltered, her glass trembling slightly before she set it down. The groom turned away, unable to answer. The waitress paused mid-step, eyes lowering, dignity shielding her from the cruelty of curiosity. In that silence, truth became louder than accusation. Every secret, every denial, every carefully constructed illusion unraveled in the hush between beats of the violin. What had once been admiration had turned into pity. The bride's laughter returned, but it was no longer beautiful. It was desperate. She raised her glass once more, voice trembling with false cheer. "To honesty," she toasted, and though the guests echoed her words, none believed them. The groom's hand shook slightly as he lifted his glass. His eyes met the waitress across the room, and in that moment, everything broke. The bride saw it. The look that no diamond, no vow, no wealth could erase. Her heart sank beneath the weight of her own victory. The applause that followed sounded hollow, the music too bright. Under the glittering lights, she realized perfection was never love, only its disguise. The moment stretched thin, silence, then the slow collapse of pretense. The bride stood at the center of her empire of light, her smile cracking beneath the weight of 1,000 eyes. The groom could no longer bear the charade. He set his glass down, the soft clink echoing louder than thunder. The music faltered, conversations froze. Every secret, every whisper, every buried truth had circled to this inevitable point. He turned toward the crowd, his voice steady, but his heart unraveling. Words that had been buried beneath guilt finally rose. Not as confession, but as release. He spoke not to shame her, but to free himself. The truth, once hidden behind gold and laughter, was now too bright to deny. His confession was quiet, but it cut deeper than any outburst. He spoke of the past, of hunger, of struggle, of the woman who had given him kindness when the world had none to offer. He told them she had saved his life not through wealth or power, but through compassion. Each word stripped away another layer of illusion, until only truth remained. The guests shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, the bride paling under the weight of honesty. The waitress stood still, tears glinting like glass, but never falling. It wasn't scandal they witnessed. It was revelation. For the first time, the room felt real. When his voice faltered, the hall remained silent. No applause, no whispers, only the quiet hum of truth settling over polished marble. The bride's hands shook as she tried to steady her breath, but her reflection in the mirrored walls betrayed her. Perfection had fled. She turned to him, her words trembling, asking why the past had come here, into their perfect night. He met her gaze with a gentleness that broke her anger apart. "Because lies don't last forever," he said, and for the first time he looked free. The waitress lowered her head, a single tear tracing down her cheek, not for loss, but for release. The bride turned toward the crowd, seeking refuge in their admiration, but their faces held only quiet judgment. The power she once wielded had vanished, replaced by pity. She could feel the weight of her choices, every cruel word, every act of pride, collapsing inward. The groom reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm, not to claim, but to comfort. "You don't have to keep pretending," he whispered. She stared at him, the warmth of his voice more painful than anger. The waitress watched from the shadows, her eyes soft with understanding. Forgiveness had already begun. Not loudly, but like dawn breaking through a storm. The music began again, soft, hesitant, as if testing whether beauty could exist after truth. The bride's eyes lowered, her voice breaking as she whispered an apology too quiet for most to hear. The groom turned toward the waitress, their eyes meeting one last time. No words were spoken, none were needed. The past had been honored, the present had been purified, and the future, uncertain but clean, stretched ahead. As the guests dispersed, the bride stood beside her husband, no longer radiant, but real. The waitress slipped out into the night, her footsteps echoing softly down the marble hall. Some stories end in love, others end in clarity. This one, perhaps, found both. Dawn crept over the horizon, brushing the sea with gold. The grand terrace that had hosted laughter and pride now stood quiet, scattered with petals and forgotten glasses. The bride sat alone beneath the fading canopy, her gown dulled by morning light, her beauty softer, more human. The night's grandeur had dissolved into humility. The groom stood nearby, watching her in silence, knowing that no apology could rewrite what pride had burned. Somewhere along the path to the staff quarters, the waitress carried trays of linens, her steps unhurried, her heart strangely light. The world had reset, not in triumph or defeat, but in truth. The sea whispered forgiveness for those willing to listen. The groom approached her slowly, the soft scrape of his shoes on marble the only sound. He didn't speak at first. There was nothing left to justify. The air between them held no blame, only the hollow echo of what had been lost. She looked up, her voice fragile but honest. "Did you ever love her?" she asked. He hesitated, not from guilt, but from truth. "Yes," he said finally. "But not the way I should have. It was not cruelty, but clarity. The kind that heals only by breaking." Her tears fell silently, each one dissolving the last remnants of pride. When she finally looked away, she felt lighter. Some heartbreaks don't destroy. They cleanse. In the kitchen, the morning hum had returned. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of steam, the rhythm of work that never stopped. The waitress moved among it all like calm water, her motions graceful, her smile faint but true. She had endured cruelty without hatred and walked away with her dignity untouched. The hotel manager thanked her quietly, his eyes kind with newfound respect. For her, there was no bitterness, only closure. As she stepped outside, sunlight touched her face like a blessing. She had seen the power of humility, and it had carried her further than pride ever could. The groom found her by the back gate, where Bougainvillea climbed the white stone walls in bursts of magenta. He didn't ask her to stay. Some things weren't meant to be reclaimed. Instead, he thanked her, voice trembling not from regret but gratitude. She smiled, small and genuine, and wished him peace. In that simple exchange, the weight of years dissolved. He realized then that real love is not possession, it's release. The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers. As she walked away, her shadow growing smaller under the rising sun. He watched until she disappeared into the light, knowing he had finally done one thing right, letting go with grace. By noon, the wedding that had begun in glitter ended in silence. The bride watched from the terrace as her guests departed, their polite smiles concealing the lessons they would take with them. She no longer cared for gossip. Her heart had learned something wealth never taught her: the worth of humility. The groom stood beside her, their silence no longer cold, but clean. Far below, the waitress walked along the coastal road, her steps light, her gaze steady toward the open horizon. The sea stretched endlessly, a mirror of calm and renewal. Some stories end with rings, others end with awakening. This one ended with 3 souls, broken, honest, and finally free.